Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here. Welcome to the Night Conference Center at the Newseum. I'm Charles Haynes, and I direct the Religious Freedom Education Project here. And on behalf of our project and ISPU, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, the British Council, and the Interfaith Alliance, our partners with putting together today's symposium, I want to welcome you and thank you for being here. The only people in Washington, D.C. who aren't standing in front of the Supreme Court. Your minds may be there, but your hearts are here. And we appreciate that, or at least your bodies are here. Maybe your hearts are not here. We'll try to, in these days of social media, I was going to say we'll let you know. We don't have to let you know. Everybody is going to know. Everybody is wired to know these things immediately. So, but we deeply appreciate your participation today. And you're not standing in the 100-degree heat waiting for the decision. That's another good thing. You can hear about it in the cool of the Night Conference Center. So thank you. It's going to be a very exciting day, I think. And as you know, or you wouldn't be here, those of us who organized this, think not only is the symposium a good idea, we think it's a matter of some urgency because, of course, with the rise in anti-mosque protests around the country, with the proliferation of anti-sharia laws, with all kinds of heated rhetoric in the public square of America, it's a difficult time. It's a challenging time. And, in the First Amendment world, we always have that adage that if there's speech you don't like, the answer to that is speech you do like, more speech. And so that was our idea today, is to have civil, reasoned, intelligent discussion about some of these difficult issues in order to bring about, we hope, a greater understanding in a public square where there's great misunderstanding and confusion about all of the issues we're going to address today. So I deeply appreciate our partners for helping put this together and for you to participate. You're going to be very much participating in this today, I hope, and asking your questions, and we hope that we'll involve you throughout the day, but in a good way. So that means turn off your ringers, because we don't want that kind of participation, so that we won't have that. But turn on Twitter. We do like that. So there's good sounds, bad sounds, but we certainly want you to tweet. So please feel free to do that. Well, with that, I'm going to start the first panel and first announce to you why you're seeing only three of us up here. Unfortunately, Inji Abdelkader took ill last night, and I understand that she's doing fine, but had to be taken to the hospital, and so it's something that obviously meant that she couldn't be with us this morning. So we send her best wishes, and we're sorry that she can't join us. But that just means you all will have to help out with the third panel member with your questions and your comments. So let's get underway with Professor Kathleen Moore, who is Professor of Religious Studies and Political Science at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and the author of a number of things, but her book is The Unfamiliar Abode, Islamic Law in the United States and Britain. You have more information about the speakers, so I'm not going to go into their biographies in depth, just introduce them briefly. And also, I'm joined by Treene, who is Special Counsel for Religious Discrimination at the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. And before joining the Department of Justice in 2002, Eric was at the Beckett Fund, Director of Litigation at the Beckett Fund for Religious Liberty here in Washington, D.C. So let's jump right in, because today is a day where we're going to look at a great many issues through the day, but this is a framing discussion. So we're going to try to talk in the first session about the constitutional and legal principles that frame much of what we're going to talk about today, and how they're working or not working in the United States. And we're also going to connect this to how things are working in the United Kingdom and Europe. So that's a big agenda. So in this first hour, we're going to start with those framing principles. But I think the first thing to say or to ask, and Eric, I'm going to start with you because this is your job. How would you describe the problem? I mean, maybe it's an obvious thing to say, but from your perspective, dealing with complaints of discrimination and problems around the country, how would you describe the challenges or the problems that are facing American Muslims, religious freedom challenges that are facing American Muslims today?
Well, from a civil rights standpoint, 9/11 was a real inflection point for the Muslim community, as well as the Arab, Sikh, and South Asian communities. If you look before 9/11, there were some employment cases involving Muslims and hijab, a small number of hate crimes. I mean, I'm talking about 15, 20 per year reported in the FBI crime report, as opposed to 1,000 anti-Semitic crimes. Then 9/11 comes along, and suddenly you see a huge spike, 300 hate crimes in a matter of 3 months right after 9/11 against Muslims, Sikhs, South Asians, and Arab Americans. That was really a defining moment, and it unleashed a number of issues. Head coverings. Head coverings in the schools had not been a problem prior to 9/11. It's not an issue like it is in Europe. Then sometimes it became a problem in the U.S. There's legal protections against it. We can get to that in a minute. But we have had several instances where schools tried to get girls to not wear the headscarf. Mosque controversies. And this is actually a recent phenomenon in the last 2 years, really. After 9/11, we saw a few of these controversies where cities denied permits to mosques that they would have granted or had granted regularly to churches. And then about two and a half years ago, we started to see a real uptick. We've opened 30 cases involving mosques since this law that we'll talk about a little later, RLUIPA, was passed in 2000. 20 of those have been in the last 2 years. So that's an area of real growth in civil rights challenges for Muslims. And the EEOC also reports a steady flow of discrimination and harassment cases in the workplace. So there are a lot of challenges out there. Again, many different religious groups face these, but the difference is there was a real change with the Muslim community, where they were really under the radar when you contrast them with the Jewish community in terms of sort of deliberate animus-based hate crimes. Now the numbers are way up. They're lower than they were after 9/11, but they're still a factor of 8, 9 times what they were prior to 9/11.
Kathleen, do you want to add to how you see the problem or problems or challenges in a way that maybe comes from a different angle?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of what Eric has just said resonates with what I would give sort of a broader name to that. And I think that the number one set of problems that Muslims face today can be defined with one word, and that's security, right? And not the security in the sense that when we hear that, we usually think about securitizing the American state and society against terrorist attacks. And that's not at all what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a parallel process that's taking place in the imagination of Muslims, and that is the sense of feeling secure. Can I feel secure not only in the privacy of my home, but am I secure in public spaces, in the public culture of my own society? And so these kinds of instances that you're talking about with discrimination in the workplace or hate crimes or the failure to license or give zoning permits for building mosques are just examples where there is a different standard of treatment for Muslims in American society. And so I consider this all following under the rubric of security, and this is where I think the Constitution comes into play in terms of, if you want me to talk a little bit about constitutional principles.
Sure, let's get to that in a second, but just to make sure we get all the things on the table, neither of you mentioned, you mentioned public schools in terms of the head covering. I spent a lot of time in public schools. Do you hear, and I think there's a spike in challenges about accommodating Muslim religious practices. On one hand, there's been a lot of good news that there's been a lot of accommodation in many places. On the other hand, I think there's been a little pushback in recent days. And there's been some challenges to even Islam being taught in textbooks in some places, Texas, California.
Sure. Well, you mentioned schools, and one thing I did neglect was harassment and bullying. The evidence is mostly anecdotal, but we have seen, in our experience in the enforcement end, an increase in reports of kids being harassed, bullied, beaten in school. And it's a significant problem. And often it's a problem people don't realize. We were out in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, where they had a mosque controversy, and we were 2 years ago meeting with mosque leaders and other Muslim community leaders. And as we sort of got talking, and talked more broadly about civil rights, stories kept coming up. Well, my son had this problem at school, and I said, well, that's illegal. If he's facing that kind of harassment, the school needs to take action. And often folks don't realize that this is bigger than just a bunch of kids beating up my son. That this is a civil rights issue. If he's being picked on because of their religion or their ethnicity, that's a civil rights issue that there are legal mechanisms and other, Department of Education has various remedies to bring to play.
Yeah. Kathleen, you want to comment on that, the school situation? Have you heard reports of this?
Right. There are the reports that you're talking about of anti-Muslim bias within the schools, coming from peers and in some cases even from teachers. But there's also the other issue about what's been considered the impermissible promotion of religion, as you were saying with the curriculum. If Islam is taught as a subject, as a world religion, then is this violating the separation of church and state? And there is also an instance in Minnesota where 2 public charter schools were closed down because it was charged that they were impermissibly promoting religion in the way that they were teaching Arabic language. And so these kinds of issues are very much, like you said, there's a pushback. I think that there has been, in some observers' eyes, too much accommodation of religion within the public sector.
And there's also this charge of soft peddling of teaching Islam, and there even charges. I get emails from school districts saying we're told now that you don't treat Christianity in the same way. You have critiques of Christianity in the textbooks, but Islam is treated in as kind of an easy way or a whitewashing of problems. So I've gotten a lot of this kind of reaction to textbooks.
And we see this with equal access issues. For a long time, it's been the law in the U.S. that a Bible club has to be able to meet if a chess club meets. And there have been these controversies, but Bible club, Christian Bible club, we've brought actions to enforce this right. And then this has also come up with Muslim students who want to gather to pray. And you do get a little more pushback, like, well, why are they getting a special room to pray in? Aren't we, endorsing their religion? Aren't we, isn't this sort of sharia or whatever slogan people want to put on it of advancing Islam in the U.S.? I said, we do this all the time. I have hundreds of cases where we've done this with Christian students who wanted to meet, and the school administrators were uncomfortable with that. But they say, no, they have a right to gather because the school can't promote religion, but students are allowed to bring their faith with them when they come to school.
Now, neither of you mentioned the new lawsuit against the New York City Police Department. You probably don't want to talk about current litigation, I'm assuming. Have you looked at this yet, this new lawsuit that has just been filed by Muslim advocates against the New York City Police Department? No. Well, it's about surveillance issues. So generally, of course, there's now a lot of concern about how police departments are treating the Muslim community. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on that generally, not talking about a particular lawsuit. Do you hear?
I mean, that's really outside the Civil Rights Division. The work that I do on religious freedom, and then the police piece is really a separate area. So I really can't get into that.
All right. Well, we won't push you to talk about something it's not in your bailiwick. I want to get to the audience in a second. I want to first get to some constitutional and legal principles so that we can get those on the table before I turn to everybody to ask questions and make comments. But what are the principles that you use in your work and that you think are important constitutionally, legally, to address this range of issues and to somehow find a resolution to these issues in local communities?
Well, I think our unique history in the U.S. with the fight against segregation and the African American experience has given us a leg up compared to other countries on addressing anti-Muslim bias. Because in the 1960s, in response to segregation, Congress enacted the Civil Rights Act of 1964 with strong protections against discrimination in employment, in public accommodations, then the Fair Housing Act in 68 for discrimination in housing, a really robust, muscular infrastructure for combating discrimination based on race. But when Congress passed it, they also added sex, national origin, and religion. So we have not only a framework of laws, but DOJ, we have a civil rights division with 400 lawyers who do this kind of work, and an infrastructure around the country of the Community Relations Service of DOJ, U.S. Attorney's offices, and state and local laws dealing with civil rights. And there's a lot of capacity here for confronting these problems that some other countries, when I speak to judges and attorneys from overseas, just have nothing like it, where the government can enforce these rights, or a very strong private cause of action as opposed to administrative remedies and so forth. So there we have a very strong infrastructure with the Civil Rights Act. And then in 2000, Congress passed RLUIPA, the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, protecting the rights of religious communities to build places of worship, to build religious schools, and the rights of prisoners to exercise their faith. Now, this was passed, if you look at the legislative history, I was very concerned with synagogues that were having trouble. There were records of minority faiths having a more difficult time, but mosques really weren't on the radar screen. There were a lot of evangelical storefront churches that were startups that were running into zoning problems, and then a lot of synagogues. But this was enacted in 2000, right before 9/11 hit, and has been a real help to those of us in law enforcement to give us the tools to ensure that things like a minaret ban, like you saw in Switzerland, couldn't happen here. I mean, this isn't to say we don't have controversy. We sometimes have to go in and sue to win the rights because a town, Lilburn, Georgia, blocked a mosque from expanding. But we have the tools to go into the community, to file a lawsuit, and let them do what every other faith group gets to do, which is to build a place to worship.
Well, Eric, I want to back up a second, because you're talking about RLUIPA, and some folks may not realize why not the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment? Why can't you just invoke that? And why this special legislation to give what? Don't we have that under the Free Exercise Clause? And some people may not realize how the Supreme Court has changed the rules on free exercise of religion, and how that really changes some of these, how you can address or should address some of these issues.
Well, it's kind of a long story, but we'll make it as short as possible. The Supreme Court, 1990, in the Smith decision, a case involving Native Americans who wanted to take the drug peyote, said the Free Exercise Clause does not give you any right to an exemption from generally applicable laws. If there's some law that applies to everybody, like no wine in this county, you don't get an exemption because you need to take communion wine or you need to take peyote. So Congress tried some other legislation that was struck down and then passed RLUIPA, looking at the record and using its enforcement powers under the 14th Amendment, ruled in the area of land use, saying that if it affects interstate commerce, an issue that's going to be decided up on the Hill today, interstate commerce, but if it affects interstate commerce, then Congress can regulate in this area and give protection for places of worship. And then there were some exceptions in the Supreme Court jurisprudence that were really complicated, involving when you give a lot of discretion to a government decision maker, that there's a heightened review there. And the land use area is an area where you see a lot of that discretion, where a set of facts comes before the city council and they get to vote yea or nay based on a lot of subjective criteria. And so RLUIPA codified these complicated free exercise principles about this kind of leeway for decision makers and put it forth in this law. So it gives...
At heart, we had to get through legislation what we lost under free exercise through our LUPA, but in a very limited way.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the Congress tried to restore strong free exercise protection with Religious Freedom Restoration Act, 20th anniversary of which is coming up soon, and the Supreme Court struck that down, at least as applied to the states. But it should be at least said that many states have passed their own Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, and so does that help in your, well, not necessarily in your work, but in general in how these issues are resolved around the country? If you're in a state that has a Religious Freedom Restoration Act, aren't you in better shape to complain against a law or to get an exemption from a law than if you're in another state?
I think you are, but the areas facing the Muslim community, which is the focus today, really land use is the big one, and so RLUIPA picks up that. And then you have employment issues and school issues, and federal laws already pick up that. There may be some other things on the margins, but for the most part, those big areas of controversy are covered by the federal law.
And our LUPA picks up prisoners, too, and there are a lot of Muslim prisoners that have complaints. Kathleen, could you comment on the American principles and so forth? But I know you want to, and I want you then to link it to what's going on in Britain and elsewhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that much of what you've spoken about has been statutory law, and I take your point that this legislation has been necessary because of the trends in the Supreme Court jurisprudence in interpreting religious liberty. And I think that there are a couple of opinions that have come out recently that are indicating where the court is on the Constitution as it relates to issues that Muslims face. And one is the recent Hosanna Tabor about the ministerial exception to religious hiring law. And the other one is a couple years ago, a Citizens United decision about campaign finance contributions, and that corporations are people too, afforded the protection under the First Amendment. And I've seen that affect actually indirectly the way that employers are defending their practices not to hire Muslims. And let me give you a case in point as an example. Is that I'm an expert witness in a case now against Abercrombie and Fitch, which the EEOC is representing a woman who interviewed for a job and was not hired. She was wearing the headscarf. And in deposition, it became quite clear that the defense that Abercrombie is mounting in this particular case is to say that it is their free speech right to have the look, which they promote. There's a particular dress code that their employees must wear. And it's sort of a Citizens United argument to say that we have, as an individual would, a free speech right here to say that we have freedom of expression in the way we choose to represent ourselves, and if that does not include conservative Islamic clothing, then that's our right under the Constitution. So they're taking a constitutional argument rather than a statutory one to defend themselves against a statute that would protect civil rights. So I see that as becoming, a very important division in the law in terms of, how do civil rights organizations and civil rights agencies in the government argue against these kinds of constitutional arguments that are being made. And then to link that to Britain, I want to say that the British example is not constitutional but is statutory in terms of their race relations laws and human rights laws. But there's also the move by the government to recognize Sharia councils and to recognize the operation of Sharia law within the British context and to give official recognition of decisions reached by Sharia councils. You may know that a couple of years ago, I think it was 2008, Archbishop Rowan Williams made a speech which ruffled a lot of feathers in Britain, which basically said it's time now to recognize that Muslims in Britain should be free to be governed if they choose by Sharia law, as long as the decisions of Sharia councils were not harming anybody, that were protected under official British law. And he called that interactive pluralism. And even though it was controversial, just a few months after that, then the High Chief Justice in Britain came out and said the same thing. And then a few months after that, the British government kind of quietly admitted that, yes, we are acknowledging, we are officially giving a judicial enforcement to the decisions of a network of Sharia councils that they had designated as being the official interlocutor between the Muslim communities in Britain and the government. And so there is a recognition of how Sharia operates, but there was backlash against that, and I call that in the book the fear of Shariocracy. And I think we see some of the same rationale behind the fear of Shariocracy in Britain, behind some of the creeping Sharia arguments here in the United States about the supposed introduction of Sharia law in places like Oklahoma, where they had a referendum against that and stuff. And I think the argument is, underpinning the whole debate against Sharia or for Sharia is really kind of the need to rescue from culture those people that the state thinks would be most vulnerable to conservative interpretations of religion in general. And so there's a common fear, of the spreading of Sharia, the fear of jihadism, the fear of terrorism, jihadist-related terrorist charges, and so forth, that some observers feel justifies rooting out some unwanted ideas or tendencies to go Islamic. And so that has really, I think, polarized the debate in both Britain and the United States.
Well, there are a great many people who are talking about creeping Sharia in the United States who say that, look at the UK, we are moving there. Is that possible? And I mean, whether you think it's positive or negative what's happening in the UK, and you can say, but is it possible that same kind of model could be replicated in the United States?
I think that primarily because the population that we're talking about is quite different in both countries, that's probably not going to happen, that America's not going to go down the path that Britain has. Because in Britain, a lot of the Muslim population has been concentrated in some of the urban industrial areas and also is exceedingly young. And there are fewer opportunities for education and employment in Britain for what are generally the working class population. And in the United States, the Pew Forum, I think, on religion and public life, had a study a few years ago that they called Muslim Americans middle class and mostly mainstream, where they indicated, they have data that show that most Muslims in the United States are highly educated and middle class. And so there's a vast disparity between Britain and the United States in terms of the class and income and educational levels. And so the policies that have been developed by the two different governments are quite
different. About it legally and constitutionally, would it, we're different, and how would you characterize the difference?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that point. We had in last October a 10-year retrospective on civil rights after 9/11, and the Pew Forum did a presentation, and one of the data points was very interesting. Is if you ask Muslims how they feel about their lives and their communities, the numbers are basically parallel to what the general population of the U.S. has, even a little bit better. It was like 76% have a very a positive view versus 74% for most Americans, reflecting that you have a well-integrated minority that's doing fairly well economically and culturally. But then you also have the numbers of uneasiness about civil rights. So there is this uneasiness out there in the community. But there's also, in general, a good story of success in America.
Right. Do you want to compare it at all to UK's legal framework?
Well, the legal framework, you probably can speak better to that. I can speak about the American system, but comparatively.
We're going to later today talk more about Sharia law and how religious laws in general connect to constitutional law. But I just want to give you a chance to say anything you'd like about it now. In other words, I think a lot of people are looking abroad and not thinking about carefully about how that might apply here. And it seems to me it's quite a different starting point with the First Amendment,
Sure.
which UK does not have in the same way we do.
And we have a long experience of incorporating minorities. If you look at the 19th century, many of the criticisms you hear of the Muslim community were directed at the Catholic community. This was a foreign religion that was royalist in structure, was fundamentally anti-democratic, internationalist, and Catholic.
Political.
Yeah, political, and these Catholics could never become good democratic Americans. And you saw a lot of organized anti-Catholic animus, and now it's sort of hard to think of America without Catholic culture as part of it. And you look at the Mormons, how alien and political they were viewed, and then you have a group that's really done quite well. And so I think there are a lot of ways to look, and then the Jewish experience, which I know Mark Stern will be talking about this afternoon, and how Jewish contract law and marital law and those issues for years have been incorporated within the American framework.
Well, you mentioned, Eric, that things are going pretty well. And Kathleen, would you like to, I'm going to turn to the audience now, but would you like to say whether you think things are going pretty well in terms of the problems that we've talked about? How are we doing? And how are we doing in relation to the UK, if you want to say something about that?
Yeah, I think the very hopeful sign and why I have optimism is that you see, especially in the United States, that that there is a generation of Muslim Americans who are active and have been very attentive to these questions about justice and civil rights and civil liberties. And so we need to pay attention, I think, to the lives and the works and the ideas of this young activist intellectual who was actually very, very young when things like 9/11 happened, or 7/7 in Britain. And so there is a rise in organizing religious advocacy. In general, in the United States, that's quite true. There are well over 200 religious advocacy organizations that are registered as lobbyists, and of those, 17 or 18 of them are Muslim, and many of them have been founded since the 1990s. So you see an increase in civic engagement, and I think that's very helpful. You'd mentioned Muslim Advocates has filed a lawsuit concerning surveillance in New York, New Jersey, and I think that's a very hopeful sign. And you see that in the United States, and you see it less pronounced in Britain. But there are several non-governmental organizations that have appeared. But I see that as a hopeful sign.
Let me turn to the audience now, and we have a microphone here and a microphone there, and if you wouldn't mind asking your question at a microphone, that would be helpful since we're taping and want to be sure to hear. Yes, sir. And tell us who you are. And yeah.
Hello?
No, you just speak into it. They'll get it on for you.
Hey, my name's Paul Hamshaw, and I'm actually an appellate lawyer at the EEOC. I had one quick question, and then one is there a significant problem in housing? Do we know? In Fair Housing Act? Over
it's
some issues?
Yes, but it's largely anecdotal evidence at this point, not to the extent that we see in the employment sector. But we do get reports of people, coming in to inquire about an apartment, and they're told there is, and then he comes back later with his wife who's wearing a hijab, and suddenly there's no apartment. So there is some of that going on. I don't have any quantitative data on that, but it's not of the scale that you see in employment.
And then, Dr. Moore, can you spell out a little more when you're contrasting U.S. and U.K., and you said that there's a significant difference in the economic circumstances and the class issues. Do you mean, or why does that make a difference for? In other words, what's your understanding of how Muslim Americans feel about being able to practice Sharia? Are you saying that because they're middle class they don't care about that, or because they're middle class they don't? I don't understand how that relates to whether Sharia is okay.
Right. No, I'm not sure I made the connection, but I'm not saying that because they're middle class they don't want Sharia to operate. People want accommodation of religious practices, and whether we call that allowing Sharia to operate or not, there's a great deal of debate about what does Sharia cover, what does fiqh cover, and so on. It's not really correlated to their income. But what's happened in Britain is with the recognition of the operation of Sharia councils. Sometimes these Sharia councils are attached to mosques, and they're located in housing estates. They're in very low-income areas, and so they're governing lives of people who don't have access to other resources, like education at the same. There's a different standard of treatment for them in terms of access to educational opportunity in Britain and employment opportunities. And so knowing that they have resources outside of Sharia councils that they can exercise through the British courts, there's a problem with getting information out and making sure that people know what their rights are. So I guess that would be the class component, is the concentration of Sharia councils attached to mosques in housing estates in Britain. In the United States, I don't think that there's a class component to whether or not somebody wants their religious norms to be accommodated under the law. I think that when I go and speak to Muslim communities, in panel discussions like this, often, they're concerned about what is the impression that non-Muslim Americans have when you use the word Sharia. And it's clear that nobody wants, the criminal penalties of Sharia law to be imposed. But many people are surprised when my response is to say, Sharia is already here. I mean, what are we concerned about, a Sharia debate? Because in the United States, under a lot of the civil rights legislation, there is accommodation of things in family courts, in marriage contracts and child custody, dissolution of marriages. There are cases where courts will accommodate certain religious norms anyway. So that's been going on for decades, and nobody has been concerned about the impact of Sharia operating in the United States. Accommodation of dietary law, that also has been ongoing for several decades, and to no harm to anybody. So.
Do you want to comment on accommodation and how far it goes or doesn't go in the United States?
Well, the standard in the U.S. For accommodation in employment, for example, is an employer must make a reasonable accommodation of someone's religious observances and practices, and unless the employer can prove that it would be an undue hardship on the employer. So if you have someone at McDonald's and they say, well, no one wears head coverings, you say, well, it's not a big deal to have someone wear a headscarf. When it gets to be a uniform of a police officer, then it becomes a more difficult issue because the interest in a uniform is greater than the interest of McDonald's for uniform appearance, and then you get into some battles. We had a 7-year battle with New York Transit Authority over accommodating Muslim and Sikh bus and subway drivers who, in the end, we reached an agreement they could wear a headscarf or a turban as long as it matched the uniform of the bus driver uniform, and that they wore an ID badge up high on their jacket or shirt to indicate that they are indeed a bus driver. If the blue uniform didn't tip you off, then you have the addition of the ID badge there. And so we felt that met all the needs that they asserted, and they reached an agreement. But it took a 7-year battle.
Yes.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Julie McFarlane, and I'm a law professor from Canada, and I'm also a Brit, as you can probably tell by my accent.
And you'll be joining us on a panel later today.
Yeah. But I just wanted to clarify something that I think was maybe getting, because this is confusing, a little confused. I think it's a little inaccurate to say that the United Kingdom is going in one direction with this legally, and the U.S. is going in another. In both the United Kingdom and the United States and Canada, religious tribunals are recognized under arbitration acts. They're recognized in the United States under FAA legislation. They're recognized in the United Kingdom under common law and arbitration, the Arbitration Act there, and in many parts of Canada also. The tensions and the differences arise when the courts are asked to either enforce or overrule the results of those religious arbitrations. But in actual fact, to say that the British system has taken a step towards the enforcement of Sharia, that has not happened here, is completely inaccurate, because the law is the same here. The reality, however, and this is a very important piece to take notice of, is that even though religious tribunals are recognized in many parts of Canada and the US as issuing legally binding decisions, the only way we would ever know about that is if somebody brought that decision to a court and asked them to either enforce or overrule it. And we know that the Muslim community doesn't do this. We have seen a somewhat different approach within the Jewish community, where there has historically been some interplay between the Beth Din courts and the courts of the state or the province, but there has been no such interplay between the Muslim community and the courts in Canada and the US. So my point is only, we shouldn't overstate this idea that somehow the UK has taken this radically different direction. The law is the same. The usage, however, is what may differ between the two places.
And Julie, before you leave, and Kathleen too, it's very helpful. Can I push a little harder and ask the question about the difference between UK and US on this? Courts in the United States, correct me if I'm wrong, generally we understand cannot, even when deciding from a religious tribunal, cannot get into theological
Absolutely.
issues and cannot say this is good theology,
Right.
this is bad theology.
Right.
So we have under our First Amendment a very, I think, strong barrier that keeps our courts from getting involved in the internal religious
Right.
questions.
Right.
Is that the same for courts in the UK without a First Amendment, or do courts in the UK have more scope to say, well, your interpretation of Sharia, we approve, yours we do not, and so forth, which we would not,
Right.
I think, would
Right.
not have in the United
No,
States?
absolutely. There's a religion-neutral approach. So the courts can't get into looking at the merits of the decision, but the structure is a little bit different. It's not about the substantive merits. It's about the procedural regularity of what occurred. And any religious tribunal properly constituted under an arbitration statute can have its decisions enforced. It's not about the merits of those decisions. It's about whether or not the decision has been taken.
That's in the
correct
UK
way.
as well as the
and
US.
in both the UK and the US.
All right,
So
that's-
I'm saying that in practice, there really isn't any difference, because apart from anything else, we're not seeing Muslims bringing decisions which they would recognize as emanating from a superior source to the courts for review in any case.
Yeah, this comes up a lot in the U.S. in property disputes. You'll have, say, a Baptist church, and there'll be a divide over one group follows the pastor, and the other group may have taken theology in this turn and said, well, we've got the Bible, and then we've also got this document, which is just as important. Say, just imagine that happening, and a group comes and says to a court, hey, look a minute, this group over here is claiming the property, and they aren't Baptist anymore. They're really not even Christian anymore. But you look at what the courts will do is they'll look at the documents, say there's a board of 8 people who is duly elected by the congregation, and they have the right to make decisions as to the disposition of property and all, and they look at the contract. And the court won't look at the fact that Baptists are supposed to follow the Bible and not this other book. They'll say, no, look at the document and see where the procedures followed. Did these people vote to do this? And that's how it's handled here in the U.S.
That's helpful. Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you so much for bringing all of these issues to the public. I really appreciate that. I guess my question really is I'm sorry? Yes, my name is Andra Suthi. So my question really is, we speak about the courts making decisions, but the courts are made up of people. And I work with many interfaith groups, and they're very concerned about the education of the people who are making the decisions. And many people here today in our public only have the information from the media, from television, from the newspapers, and if they're biased, that's the only information that they have to make a decision. So the question would be, What initiatives that you know are available, let's say in the UK or in America here, to educate the lawmakers? And where do they get their education to be able to make decisions that we abide by here?
Okay. You want to comment on that?
Yeah, I want to say, well, it's a large, thanks for the question. It's a very, very large in scope, though, but to answer it succinctly is that it is a procedural issue, is the last question raised, that in the courts, if a judge feels this is not something within his purview or her purview, can assign a special master to the court which can provide that expertise. So, procedurally there are ways of getting the information. But you raise a good point about the general bias and what we perceive to be Islamic or Muslim in our society, and does that affect the decision making, the decision makers in the court system. There's, sorry, I lost my train. What I was going to say to that is, I'm sorry, did you want to say something, because I lost my train of thought? It'll come back to me in a
I can
minute.
pick up. Yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there, but as Charles said, the answer for misinformation is more good information. There, a year and a half ago, a dispute in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, about a mosque, and there the county treated the mosque like it would a church because it bought land in a zone where religious uses were as of right, so all you had to do was present a site plan and they'd approve it. Mosque did that, and that's what they would have done with the church. Neighbors sued, saying, a mosque is not a church. It's not like a church. It's a part of a political movement. So if you allow this mosque, it's not like allowing a church. You're bringing in a political group that's going to impose Sharia law and overthrow the U.S. government. And they said Islam is not a religion, and a mosque is not a place of worship. And we said that's ridiculous. We filed a brief laying out the history of how the Supreme Court, the executive branch, and Congress have discussed Islam, how legal doctrines look at what is a religion, and this clearly qualified. The Anti-Defamation League had a coalition of an interfaith coalition that produced a brief that they submitted to the court saying that this is nonsense, and truth prevailed, and the court said, Islam's a religion, which of course everybody here knows. But there was misinformation, and it was organized, and some experts came in from Washington and testified about how Islam is not a religion, and there's this kind of bad information out there. But the answer to that is, more good information. And fortunately in America we have a very robust civil society, as you do in Britain as well, and that is an important bulwark in getting the accurate messages out.
Yeah, and that reminds me, and I now remember what I wanted to say to respond to that about the perceptions. There are instances like this where that show the contrary. For instance, in Orange County, California, a few years back, there was a case, a jury trial, of a Muslim woman who had an employment wrongful termination suit against her former employer, which was a school. And in the trial, it came down to the plaintiff's lawyer saying to the jury, bring what you know to bear on this. What we already know about Islam is that it's misogynistic, and it's this and it's that, and all these attributes they gave to Islam. And so we want you to rule in favor of the plaintiff in this case. And the jury went into deliberation, and they came back out, and these are 12 randomly selected members of Orange County, residents of Orange County, California, came back to the judge with a message saying that Islam is not on trial here. They wrote a note to the judge, and he wanted it read into the court record to say that both the defendant and the plaintiff had the best interests of children in mind, and they were being very objective about not ruling on this as a case of Islam being anti-woman or Islam being anti-whatever, that it was a case that was decided on its merits. So, we really have to give, I think, credit and be optimistic about the people when they're asked to make these decisions will try to do their best to be fair.
Yeah, in fact, I just add to that I think it's extraordinary when you think about all that's happened in the last decade or so, how many governments have done well on this. I don't want to be Pollyanna here, but I think Murfreesboro and other places, given the level of ignorance out there about religions, not just Islam, it's really says a lot that many local governments have done better than I would have expected, frankly, under pressure from their community to act against a religion or to call a religion a political group. And I think that you mentioned the 19th century earlier, and the Catholics, we were not doing so well then as we are now in response, because many Roman Catholics were accused of being part of a political organization with following a foreign prince, so they couldn't be good citizens and so forth and so on. Some of the same things parallel to what you hear now about Muslims. But I do think, and this just take a second to say, in answer to your very important question, I think religious illiteracy does matter. Having said that there's some good things, I think that if you ask Native Americans, for example, in this country, how well they have done in the courts over the years, I think ignorance of how people practice, what they are, who they are, does have an impact, even though justice is supposed to be blind, and even though judges are supposed to be fair-minded and so forth. If many minority religions, I think, will tell you, ignorance of who we are has hurt us in the public arena. So it's a plea for more education about religions in our schools, in our communities, so that we at least have closer to a level playing field when we go before that zoning commission or that city council. Right now, when you have, in Mississippi in a town, you have, the zoning commission and the Baptist, Methodist, and maybe a Presbyterian, that's diversity down there, and you come and you want a zoning permit, and they don't know who the heck you are. That does have an impact, as impartial as they're supposed to be. So I think it's an important issue. Religious illiteracy is important. Yes?
I'm Cynthia Butler. I'm a constitutional lawyer.
Who's your
Cynthia Butler. I'm a constitutional lawyer. I practice here, and I'm a member of California Bar.
You speak right into that mic so we can hear you.
There's some cases in federal court in California, too, because I'm a member there. Nice to meet you all. It's lovely. Thank you. My question is, I think that a lot of the laws that we are fearful of in the Sharia realm would be preempted by federal law. And we have maybe one Muslim congressman. I mean, so the fear is a little over exaggerated, I think. And so I'm wondering, demographically, comparatively with England, what's the representation in Parliament? I mean, they're like 6% in France, for example. So I can't imagine, demographically there are a lot of Muslims in the larger cities, but throughout the Parliament, what's the representation? Secondly, what laws locally, because, just take, for example, the Sharia law that if you steal something, you get your hand cut off. Okay, well, that runs afoul of most state laws on battery. So you would have to overturn laws that currently exist for Sharia to be in place. So the only way that could happen is if you have majority representation in state legislature. So that's clearly not going to happen demographically. But what laws in possibly tiny local jurisdictions, you could have enough of a majority to overturn certain laws, but which ones are not preempted that would ever create, a legitimate basis for any kind of a fear that Sharia law would overtake American law? Do you know what I'm saying?
I think I do. I think that, again, to say nobody is suggesting that we have the criminal punishments of hudud in Islamic law judicially enforced in either Britain or the United States. So a hand cutting for theft is not even on the table. This isn't what anybody's talking about. But in terms of representation, numbers are a very tricky thing. There are estimates that range widely about how many Muslims there are in the United States. But without going into much detail about that, I want to say that the estimates range from basically just below 1% of the general population up to 3% of the American population is Muslim. So we're talking about small numbers. And in Britain, they have added a religion question to their census taking in 2001. So I think their official estimate is about 3% of the population in Britain is Muslim. So your point is
how are they represented in Parliament? Do we know?
No, I don't really know. I think the House of Lords, there are some people, maybe.
Tim is going to tell us how many Muslims.
Right, no. How many there are. I'm not sure.
Running away.
He's running away.
I don't know the political representation.
Yeah, but I know there are Muslim MPs. I'm just not sure how many.
Exactly.
We have two Muslim congressmen currently.
Representatives in the House who are Muslim, and there are more elected officials, obviously at the local levels. We're talking not just the national
Yeah.
But at local levels, there are more elected officials. There are
Running as a
judges.
Muslim in the United States is a steep hill to climb, I think, in most places.
Right.
Still. Yeah. You wanted to comment on that?
I was just going to say we do have a robust establishment clause, and it looks at whether laws favor particular religions, like Texas Monthly v. Bullock, a law that favored religious publications in the sales tax. They didn't have sales tax for religious publications. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. It creates advantages for a religious group, and they look at is there harm to third parties and so forth. So there's a very strong establishment clause infrastructure in the U.S. that certainly would stop any sorts of attempts to have someone's religious belief impose costs on third parties and lead to the types of problems that I think people are worried about.
Other questions or comments from the audience before I can? You wanted to come back again? Okay.
Just another question. I'm a retired teacher, and I remember that during the course of teaching, as far as taking off holidays, the holidays are really centered around Christian holidays. Christmas vacation is now called winter vacation. Easter vacation is now called spring vacation. And teachers who are of different religions, who take off for holidays, have to make up hours. But I don't know if the Christian population has to make up any hours from the religions, from their religious holidays. So the question is anything in place in terms of legality to be able to help those of different religions?
That's a good question. We had a case just last year involving a teacher who wanted to take 3 weeks unpaid leave to go on the Hajj. And we got involved in the case, saying she had a right to it. She was willing to do it without pay. And she was a computer instructional teacher, and it would have been right at the end of one of their periods, so it wouldn't have been a big problem, but nonetheless they denied that to her. And there's a lot of criticism saying, oh, here we go again, legal system favoring Muslims. But you look back over history, there are many cases brought by the EEOC involving a group called the Worldwide Church of God that had something kind of like the Hajj. They had an annual event where the whole church comes together in the U.S. in one place, and people would need 7 or more days off to go and attend this. And EEOC had brought cases. The Department of Justice had brought cases to accommodate their right to have days off. Now, the Christian calendar tends to benefit Christians because of Christmas and Easter, but there are a lot of sects like the Worldwide Church of God and even like Ash Wednesday for Catholics sometimes create a conflict. And these have been accommodated for years and years, and that's part of our system.
And I think it's fair to say the Christians Protestants created the whole system in public education. We're not going to have school on Sunday, take Christmas off. But a lot of that has now become civic, and Christmas national holiday and so forth. So some of the accommodation is just built in for the majority faith. There's no question about that, which gives even more reason to find ways to accommodate others, if possible, as far as possible. But to tell you the truth, Christian teachers are going to have the same questions if they want accommodation for holidays that are not official holidays. Easter, for example, is no longer in most school districts, taken off. There's still some places. So if a Christian teacher wants Good Friday off, they're going to have to go through the same process as a Muslim teacher who wants their holiday off. So in that sense, I think the playing field has leveled somewhat, though some things are just built in.
Yeah, spring break doesn't follow Easter in most
not anymore.
School
districts. It used to,
anymore.
But not anymore. So some advantages are built in. But that has changed to some degree for even for Christians. Yes.
Eric, you had mentioned about the uptick in the last 2 and 2.5 years in mosque and getting building permits and expansions and things. Do you have any accounts for why that has occurred suddenly?
Oh, there are a lot of complex reasons, but I want to hesitate to speculate too much, not being a sociologist, but being a law enforcement officer representing the U.S. government. We just do see organized opposition to a degree we didn't see before. The internet buzz you see around a projects with some organized groups, national groups, getting involved in those local controversies is certainly something that we hadn't seen before. So there are a lot of complex factors, but I just don't want to speculate too much, not being a sociologist.
Do you want to say why you think there's been an uptick?
Yeah, you're free to.
Yeah, right. An uptick. You're right. The license as a professor doesn't do anything with law enforcement, really. You're saying the question is really there's an uptick in the building of mosques,
Well,
or the uptick
no,
in
in the
controversies
protests,
over mosque
controversies.
constructions.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's a location. It's a public space. I mean, it's problematized space. Where people congregate to worship, and that. With an increase in rising Islamophobia, I think it's it can be expected that the places where people congregate for worship are also going to be highly vulnerable.
And the New York City mosque controversy was 2 years ago, and that focused attention on that, and then people saw the national media, and then that can have an effect at the local level, I think.
Yeah. There is going to be later discussion in depth about mosques, but from your perspective of looking at mosques in the United States and the UK, is there truth to the propaganda that if you have a mosque in your local community, you're asking for trouble? I mean, that's what we hear now in the public arena. Is a mosque is a problematic thing to have in your community?
Yeah, I would say anecdotally. I've studied, and some of my students study the construction projects of mosques that are being built in the last decade that tend to are successful when they cooperate with other religious organizations in town in the process of getting their zoning permits approved in the town council and so on. That, for instance, in Santa Barbara, we've had a long case of going over 10 years now of building a new Islamic center, and there is local opposition to it, but to the extent that it is succeeding in getting the approvals, it's because the other faith communities stand in support of the Muslims having an Islamic center. So it can polarize communities in terms of those who stand with the Muslims and those who are fearful about the impact of Islam and the concern about Sharia within the community. But I think the numbers are still heavily skewed in favor of people who are standing in support of Muslims. There are only a few very vocal opponents. In Santa Barbara, we had a recent, what do you call that, the public review period of an application for a building permit, and there were roughly 30 letters that were sent in from the neighborhood where the Islamic center is going to be built that were negative. But 30 out of, many hundreds of people were standing in favor of the Muslim Islamic center being built.
I was in Spain last fall talking about mosque issues there and comparing the U.S. experience. And one of the problems they have there, people believe that if there's a mosque next to you, that they'll store weapons in it. And that's significant numbers of the Spanish population believe that. And you do hear some of that in the U.S. as well. And that actually is reminiscent, again, of the Know-Nothing period with anti-Catholicism, where people believed in Boston, and the Ursuline convent was burned because people thought that they were storing weapons there, that there was some plot being hatched there to take over the government. And that's the same kind of thing you're hearing today.
Well, yes, you wanted to get back in, and then I'm going to wrap this. Yeah, go ahead.
And this is maybe more a question for the audience than the speakers, but is there a discrimination in delivery of health care that the Muslim community faces or not?
Have you heard of such cases?
It's outside of our area. I know there have been some issues have come up involving male doctors treating female Muslims and some issues there about which nurse will attend to which person. That's created some conflicts in some legal cases, but I don't recall all the specifics.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Treene from the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding. We actually published a report on healthcare, the American Muslim community accessing healthcare in the U.S. and sort of similar to what you were talking about in terms of education on people on courts. It seems to be not a sort of outright discrimination. I think we don't have the hard numbers on that, but more sort of a lack of education among hospital chaplains or doctors in terms of appropriate and culturally sensitive care. So things like food accommodations, end-of-life counseling, those types of things. There's just not enough sort of awareness about that in the general hospital community. So I wouldn't say sort of outright discrimination, but more kind of a lack of education.
Lack of knowledge and understanding.
Yeah, and actually we've done a lot with training local law enforcement about basics of Islam and Sikhism. For example, like there's this video you can get online, the first 3 to 5 seconds, which is just about how you make your impressions about people. And simple issues like some cultural differences about eye contact, and how a police officer might see something as suspicious, but a recent immigrant from Arab country might, not look at you. Or if you come to the door, if there's a woman there, she may want you to come back when there's a man there, and that's not suspicious. Things about removing your shoes, just small cultural things. Now, they aren't, universal, and the American Muslim community is extremely diverse, and you don't want to make overgeneralizations, but you do want to alert police that if you encounter somebody and they're acting in this way, it's not a reason for suspicion. This is a cultural difference.
Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Hamid Yunus from Gallup, another person that you'll also be hearing from later. I just wanted to touch on this topic of sort of mosques being in a community as being a sign for trouble. What we found in our research is that actually those Muslim Americans who happen to attend a mosque more frequently are, number one, have higher well-being scores on almost all of our metrics. But more importantly, they also have higher levels of political participation. They're more likely to be registered to vote. They're more likely to be affiliated with a political party, whether it's Democrat, Republican, in this country. They're also actually surprisingly more likely to say that they've had a government job or are in a government job, and are more likely to say that they've served in the U.S. military. So there's actually data now that directly proves the opposite of this notion that sort of a mosque in your community is going to be a sign of trouble for the community at large.
That's very helpful. Do you have data on approximately how many American Muslims actually participate in mosques?
Survey research is the worst tool to use to sort of counter, census data.
Yeah.
And as mentioned earlier, we don't know that. What we found is that Muslims are as likely as all of the other major religious groups in our study to say that they attend a place of worship once a week. We found that young people, however, are less likely than their elders to participate in more frequent religious attendance, and obviously that has implications for community outreach, and hopefully we can get into that in the next panel.
So what you're actually saying is if we want to improve our community, get more civic engagement, have more positive attitudes and so forth, we should encourage mosque building in our community. And I'm not being funny. I actually think that if people understood some of what you're talking about, the notion that somehow a mosque going up in my neighborhood is going to bring all of these problems, if they understood that in fact it might bring a lot of positive benefits.
Well, and I think anecdotally, I don't want to say the inverse, because the data just shows one thing; it doesn't necessarily prove the inverse. But one thing that is interesting anecdotally is to see the degree to which local Muslim leaders have actually played a major role in foiling some of the alleged, or actual attempts at terrorist acts in the country. We're also anecdotally seeing that those that are interested in fomenting an act of terrorism or conspiring to do so are increasingly moving away from mosques as a place to congregate, as a place to recruit, because they are very aware that in most cases it's not going to be a very welcoming environment, and actually could end up foiling their conspiracy a lot earlier than would be if they would sort of stay away from the mainstream part of the community.
Thank you. One last question. I think we have a minute here for you. You want to? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't see you over here.
Sure, sorry.
Look over here, and I'll try to get you both in.
Real quickly, my name is Todd Gallender. I'm an attorney with the Council on American Islamic Relations. Actually, directing to your question about participation and the number of Muslims who participate at mosques.
Yes.
Earlier this year, we published our third report. It's an in-depth study conducted mainly by Dr. Ihsan Bagby of the University of Kentucky. We've done this for 10 years, 3 reports once every 10 years now, tracking both mosque growth as well as participation. And there is data in there collected from the mosques about number of participation, particularly during Eid prayers. So that's a good source for anybody who's interested in more information about the number of mosques, how they're growing, and where they're growing. That information is there.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes, sir. You'll be the last question in this panel.
My name is Hassan Akhlaq, and I have a point that it is more comment than a question, and it is about the meaning of Sharia in Islamic words and Islamic context, because I heard that a lot of there is a mistake between two meanings of Sharia in Islamic words. There is two different meanings as Sharia in Islamic words. One of them is Sharia is equal to the religion of Islam. Second, Sharia is a part of Islam, as a 1/3 part of Islam is equal to jurisprudence. A lot of problems originate from this point that we reduce Sharia, we reduce Islam to a Sharia, then we separate Sharia from Islam as a jurisprudence. And we don't understand, we can't understand the meaning of that law, the meaning of that jurisprudence, and we can't understand the goal of that matters. This is a very important problem in understanding of Islam. Okay.
Thank you for your comment, and you actually have set us up for our panel on Sharia law, and I think they will then be addressing a lot of the issues that you raise about the definition of it and how it relates to Islam in general. So thank you. That's very helpful setup for the panel. We didn't pay you to do it, but it's a good setup. I want to end by, before I say thank you to both of you who've done such a great job in talking about these things, do you have anything to say about the future? And from your perspective, are you optimistic about how we're going to be applying our religious freedom principles, our civil rights laws? Are we heading in a positive direction, or do you think we're facing even more difficult time than we have in the past decade? I mean, I know that's a hard maybe question to answer, but I think at the end people might like to know your level of optimism or pessimism about this American arrangement in religious freedom and civil rights. And the UK too, if you like. Kathleen?
No, I think, as I said before, I'm quite optimistic because I see, a rise in, Muslim attention to these problems, and that, many Muslims in the United States have moved from a position of perhaps isolationism, which was predominant 30 years ago, toward an enhanced awareness of what is at stake, if Muslims refuse to engage in a pluralistic society. So I think we see the results in terms of increased levels of civic engagement, and that's a very optimistic sign. So I would just leave it at that.
Eric?
I'm optimistic, mostly because I'm just generally optimistic about America. It's just my nature. But I think the Muslim Americans have a community. It's very diverse, but it has really become part of America. And I don't say this in a Pollyannish way, because I recognize, you look at the Know-Nothing period and look at Catholics, and there were waves of anti-Catholic sentiment that grew and then it receded and grew and receded. Hopefully we won't go through a 100-year process like we did with anti-Catholicism. But I'm optimistic about America and the way that for hundreds of years we've taken many different minority groups and made them part of our culture and our country, and I don't see any reason for Islam to be any different.
Well, I'm glad for some of the optimism. I think we'll see the rest of the day how that plays out. From the perspective of someone who deals with religious freedom on a daily basis, I have to say I'm optimistic as well. I still think we're part of the boldest and most successful experiment in liberty of conscience and religious freedom the world has ever seen, living in the United States, with all of our difficult history and with all of our flaws, all of the challenges we have with this current wave of reaction to American Muslims. I still think the framing principles of the First Amendment are vibrant and strong. I think our civil rights protections are strong, and I think we have something to be optimistic about when we see local communities responding fairly well to some of their tests. So I think we can end at least this panel on an optimistic note, because I think the three of us feel that way. We'll see how the other panels address these issues. But I'd like to end by thanking both of you, Eric and Kathleen, for your participation and your thoughtfulness.